Hello recap lovers, welcome to the Cinema Sins. In today's video, we'll watch a 2002 crime film, Catch Me If You Can. So, grab your popcorns and keep an eye out for spoilers. The film opens with a segment from the television program Tell the Truth, which introduces Frank William Abagnale. The host recounts his background and claims that between 1964 and 1967, he successfully passed himself off as an aviator and flew more than 2 million miles for free, while simultaneously serving as the Georgia Hospital's chief president pediatrician and the state of Louisiana's assistant attorney general. He collected about $4 million in phony checks before the age of 19 in all 50 states and 26 other countries, making him the most successful con artist in U.S. history. On the broadcast, a woman questions Frank, asking, "Why didn't you pursue a professional career with all your ability and intelligence?" He responds, "It was all for money." She then asks, "Who eventually got you?" To which he replies, "Carl Hanratty." The film jumps to the year 1969. In France, Carl is requesting to visit Abagnale by speaking with a few guards. He follows the guards inside the cell and discovers Abagnale seated in the corner of his cage, wheezing pitifully. Carl begins reading extradition clauses. As stated by the European Court for Human Rights, Carl believes Frank is playing a joke on him when he begs for his assistance. When Frank faints and falls onto the floor, Carl requests a doctor. The Frenchmen reply that the doctor would arrive the next day. While Carl and the guards are conversing, Frank manages to escape. He attempts to flee while being encouraged by the other prisoners, but because of his illness, he is recaptured. The scene cuts to a ceremony in 1963, from 6 years before, when Frank Sr. and Paula, his wife, are introduced. Frank Sr. explains to Frank Jr. how he and his mother met. The following day, when father and son go to buy a suit for Frank, Darcy, the store owner, is not ready to allow them in since the business won't open for another half hour. But Frank Sr. fools her with a gold necklace, and Frank notices. Soon, when Frank Sr. enters a bank to request a loan, the bank declines since the government is looking into him for tax evasion. Next, they all move into a small apartment while his father sells his automobile for cash. Frank enrolls at a new school where he is bullied by two boys. Frank poses as the French class's temporary replacement instructor. The administrator, when she learns that Frank has been teaching French for the previous week, and that he was even organizing a field trip and a parent-teacher conference. He informs his parents, but Frank's parents remain silent. One day, when Frank returns from school, he discovers his mother and Jack Burns sharing a bed. He learns that his parents are getting divorced in a few days, and he has to choose the parent with whom he wishes to live. He flees, though, and makes his way to Grand Central. The scene cuts to 1969 Paris, where Frank is being held captive by Carl. They are awaiting their New York City flight. The flashback then resumes. Frank defrauds Pan Am Airways in order to get one of their outfits. Frank creates a bogus paycheck and deposits it. Since his strategy is successful, he creates several other fake checks and sells them for cash. Then, while traveling to Miami, Frank pretends to be a deadhead. To get all the information he needs to carry out more bank crimes, Frank even goes so far as to court a bank employee. At an auction, he even purchased a MIC-R machine. His actions were quickly discovered, and Carl Hanratty from the FBI began an investigation. Frank takes a flight to Hollywood, where Hanratty and his two other agents are pursuing Frank. Hanratty locates Frank's station and makes his way to his hotel room. Frank tricks Carl into thinking he is an agent from the U.S. Secret Services when he breaks into the room and discovers him. As Carl waits for Frank to return, Frank hands him his wallet and instructs him to keep it while he fetches the evidence from the basement. Carl soon discovers rubbish when he opens the wallet, realizing that he just let his criminal go. In the next scene, Carl visits the new house of Frank's mother. She is now wed to Jack Barnes, the club's president. They show her a picture of Frank and inform her that he has been cashing forged checks for more than $1.3 million. Following a party where one of his friends was hurt, Frank had to visit the hospital where he got the inspiration to pretend to be a doctor. He later works as Dr. Frank Connors in a hospital in Georgia after fabricating a Harvard diploma. Carl visits Frank's father's residence, where he discovers a letter from Frank and travels to Georgia using the address on the postcard. Meanwhile, Frank is now attempting to sleep with Brenda, one of the nurses. She informs him that her father is a lawyer after telling him that she had an abortion 2 years ago and her parents kicked her out. Frank thinks it would be a good idea to see Brenda's father in Orleans and propose to her while also claiming he wants to return to law. Once there, Frank confesses that he was neither a doctor nor an airline pilot, but that he did love Brenda. So, Brenda's father gave his blessing to the couple. The film then shifts to present, where Frank is a prisoner. As they go to New York, Carl and Frank have a conversation. Frank doesn't respond when Carl presses him on how he cheated on the New Orleans bar test, and the movie returns to the past. Frank has begun working as a lawyer when Frank travels to invite his father to the wedding, where he attempts to set up Frank Sr. and Paula to rekindle their romance. However, Frank Sr. informs him that his mother wed Jack Barnes, a friend of the family, and that the IRS wants more money and that he is considering suing them. Carl, clearly, ignores Frank's advice to cease pursuing him when he phones him later. Frank then ends the conversation with a Merry Christmas greeting. To get Frank, Carl goes to his engagement celebration. When Frank notices them, he grabs his belongings and begins to leave via the window. Brenda is instructed to meet him in 2 days at the Miami airport. Frank runs into Brenda at the airport 2 days later. He becomes excited and turns to approach her. But then he sees one agent speaking to her while wearing normal clothing. As he looks around, he notices numerous agents dressed similarly. He chooses to leave the airport after realizing Brenda gave him up. As the Pan Am pilot, he contacts a school and requests a group of 8 women to serve as stewardesses. He then takes them with him and flees from Miami aboard an aircraft by disguising all of the women as crew members, outsmarting Handrety. 7 months later, Frank has been cashing forged Pan Am airline checks worldwide: Australia, Singapore, and several more locations. Meanwhile, Carl's head at the FBI rejects his attempts to apprehend him, despite his continued optimism. When Carl learns that the checks Frank has been using were printed in Montreal, a little French hamlet where his parents had first met, he decides to go there. There, he tracks out Frank at the manufacturing facility where the bogus checks were made and arrests him. He informs him that outside French police officers are waiting for him. Frank, though, believes Carl is lying. Frank attempts to flee, but Carl gets him to give up. Carl assures Frank that he would extradite him to the USA. After a few days and considerable battles, Frank is being returned to America by extradition. Frank is quite saddened when Carl informs him that his father has passed away. Frank enters the bathroom and spends some time there. When he doesn't return, Carl and the other agents decide to force open the door. But Frank has already vanished. He had removed the toilet seat screws and made his getaway. Frank rushes to his mother's house and discovers that she has a little daughter with Jack. He gets agitated by this as the cops arrive to take him into custody. Frank agrees to give up and rides along with them. Frank is given a 12-year jail term in a high-security facility, where he must be maintained in isolation. Later, Carl visits Frank in jail and presents him a fake check while pointing out all the strange things. He subsequently aids Carl in solving the mystery. Frank and Carl reconnect and check to assist them in deciphering the problem. They give him a position with the FBI under Carl's supervision when he handles it with ease. Once again escaping, Frank assumes the form of a pilot, but Carl stops him and allows him to take off. He informs Frank that he is no longer being followed and that he will soon be back on. Frank does return too. Frank responds that he did not cheat when Carl asks him how he managed to cheat on the Louisiana bar test. He put in 2 weeks of study and aced the test. According to his biography, Frank Abagnale had been happily married for more than 26 years, had 3 boys, and now led a tranquil life in the Midwest. In 1974, he was freed from jail, has aided the FBI in its efforts to apprehend some of the most elusive check counterfeit. He is regarded as one of the top authority on bank fraud in the world. The movie ends there.